We're going to launch into our first disruptive dialogue, and I'd like to invite our panelists and our moderator up onto the stage. We're going to continue a look at emerging technology. That's something we do here at Ag Innovation Showcase. We're focusing on gene or genome editing with a particular case with CRISPR. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator. Laura Manning is a writer with Ag Funder. She's a lawyer in the food and ag space. She's also a next generation practicing rancher. So we are delighted to have Lauren with us.
Thank you very much. So this is a panel about gene editing technologies, and it's not so much a panel about CRISPR itself, but about how we can engage with consumers and how to have a more effective dialogue. What can we learn from the GMO experience, and how do we move forward to not make maybe some of the same mistakes, and to be aware and really learn and have an effective dialogue. And here today to help us with this, we have Rachel Horowitz, CEO of Caribou Biosciences, who's an entrepreneur in the CRISPR field. We've got Neil Gutterson, Vice President of Research and Development for DuPont Pioneer, which has a deal in place with Caribou to apply its technology in agriculture. We have Deepti Kulkarni, a Senior Associate with Sidley Austin's Drug and Medical Device Regulatory Practice, who's familiar with the very complex regulatory framework for biotechnology. And Roxy Beck, who is a Vice President at Look East PR and the Director of the Center for Food Integrity. Roxy is a communication specialist and a leader of a research team that explores public attitudes about our food system. So although this isn't a panel about CRISPR specifically, I think, Rachel, it would be helpful if you could maybe just give us a short overview of what CRISPR is for those in the audience who maybe aren't immediately familiar.
Certainly. I'll even take it one level higher and describe a little bit what gene editing is or what genome engineering is. And fundamentally, it's the ability to go inside of a living cell and precisely change the DNA sequence. It could be very simple change where you're changing one nucleotide, or it could be a pretty dramatic change where you're inserting one or multiple new genes at a specific site in the genome. The CRISPR technology in particular has certainly been getting a lot of buzz recently, and it's all based on a particular protein called Cas9. And Cas9, like the other platforms for genome editing, is basically a pair of molecular scissors. It lets you target the system to a particular site in the genome and create a break in the DNA. And then the editing actually occurs by how the DNA is repaired. And that's how those changes are made, small or large.
And what do you see, Rachel, as some of the most exciting opportunities? I'm sure we could talk for hours about this, but if you could just name maybe a handful of opportunities that you think are particularly promising.
Certainly. I think one of the most exciting components of this is the ability to go directly into elite germplasm to make these directed changes. And so as we're learning through our relationship with Pioneer and a lot of the work that's happening elsewhere in the world, it's going to dramatically decrease the timeline to new product development. I think also very exciting is the ability to deploy this technology not just in some of the major row crops where we typically see biotech playing a role, but across all crops. Part of that for technical reasons and part of that for regulatory reasons, which I think we'll get into in a few minutes.
And what kinds of partnerships do you think are necessary for commercializing these ideas?
So this is a fundamental enabling technology that can be used to integrate valuable traits into elite germplasm. And so I think partnership is one of the critical ways that companies that have access to this technology can ultimately help realize its use. Without access to traits and without access to germplasm, it's just a cool tool. And so partners are key ways to access those capabilities.
So Neil, turning to you, how does DuPont see CRISPR technology being applied or adopted in agriculture, and does that change whether we're talking about small ag or big ag?
So thanks, and it's great to be here. Let me just start by a little perspective about Pioneer. You know, we've been bringing new genetics to our customers, our farmers, for 90 years. And so CRISPR gene editing is another way we can bring added value to our customers. So it starts with what their needs are. And that's ranging from water. We've talked about water, drought tolerance, managing diseases, We know that we live in a world where climate change is real, and the environment is changing even more rapidly for our customers. And we need to be able to bring new solutions to them in a more efficient way. And CRISPR gives us the opportunity to improve our germplasm, as Rachel was saying, if we know the biology that we're targeting in a very effective and very desired and designed way.
And why do you think democratization of CRISPR is important? And maybe you can briefly tell us what you mean by democratization.
Sure. So when you think about the technology that Rachel mentioned, on one level, it's actually very simple to apply. Once you introduce the CRISPR-Cas system essentially into a cell, being able to target particular locations in the genome and make those changes is pretty simple. And so to some extent, it's pretty easy to think about many people using the technology. It's sort of inherently democratic in that sense, right? So we think it's important because, for two reasons, I would say. The first is that there is so much potential value for this technology, not just in the crops that we work on, but in a wide range of crops, and not just in our own customers, but in a wide range of growers and farmers around the world. And so it's really important that we find ways to enable a wide range of potential users, whether it's small companies, whether it's academics, international ag organizations, to use the technology. But the second point is that this is a new technology, and we know that the adoption of new technologies for food can be challenging. And so, and the key to success, I think, is trust in the users of that technology and people who are going to consume the foods that are generated using this new technology. And so, we believe that one way to enhance trust is that it's not just, one or a couple of big companies who are the only ones developing technologies, bringing products forward, but many people with different approaches serving different customers, whether it's, as I said, international ag organizations serving the developing world, whether it's small companies working on specialty crops. The more diverse, the more democratized the use is, the interest is, I think we have a much better chance of building trust in the technology.
And Rachel and Neil, what do you think, or what do you see right now as some of the biggest challenges facing CRISPR, whether it's technical, funding, regulatory? What's really challenging you right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest hurdle long term is exactly what Neil just described. It's gaining trust from consumers such that we can actually see any of these products hit the market. And Caribou's perspective, I think, is very well aligned with Neil's. That we think one of the best ways to do this is to put this technology in the hands of many different breeders, people working across many different crops, and empower them to speak with their stakeholders about what this technology is, what it isn't, how these products are made, and what these products can do for consumers. Caribou is a little bit unique in that we live not only in the ag world, but also developing the technology for therapeutics, industrial applications, and basic research. And so we see a lot of the differences between some of these markets. On the therapeutic side, there are many small companies that have been founded around this technology. I read recently that more than $1 billion have been invested in those companies through venture capital, IPOs, and major partnerships. And you compare that to ag, it's a very different world. And so I think one of the challenges long term will also be identifying how to appropriately invest in deploying these technologies broadly.
So let me just add, I agree completely. The key here is social license for any new technology. And so the value of CRISPR-Cas, of gene editing, is going to be dependent on the public's acceptance of this as a very comfortable technology to be improving their food. Fundamentally, this is a breeding technology. It enhances our ability to deliver the same outcomes we get from breeding. And so how the world thinks about that, the regulatory paradigms that develop in a complex world with jurisdictions that will have different approaches, is going to be important. But whatever the regulatory outcomes are, it's really going to be about the public, their perception and their comfort with the technology. That's, I think, the key issue. There's technology issues we're working on. I mean, sure enough, you always want to improve the technology, but it's the social license and the public perception. That's the key.
So speaking of regulatory challenges, Deepti, there's a lot going on in biotech regulation right now and a lot potentially changing. What is the regulatory situation for CRISPR?
That's a great question. The regulatory situation for CRISPR is very much under development. And part of the reason for that is that the regulatory paradigms for biotech products, particularly in the ag space, are based on technologies that CRISPR has far outpaced. These technologies are, typically transgenic or rDNA technology, and based on those frameworks, the regulatory agencies, particularly in the US, have developed regulatory triggers for when they will review a particular product, right? So as we've seen on the EPA side, the USDA side, one regulatory trigger is whether you've introduced new or different genes into a plant product such that the plant product may pose to be a plant pest. But if you don't have that introduced DNA, what happens to the framework? We've seen an outcome where USDA has said, well, this doesn't fall within our regulatory purview. Something that we've talked about with respect to social license is rather than calling that a loophole, it's part of the risk-based paradigm. If there's no risk for which USDA has to review the product, then it fits the mold, right? But others have argued that the technology far outpaces the mold, and so it doesn't fit the paradigm. In other applications, particularly on the FDA side, there are similar questions. So with respect to animals, a question that is the threshold question for FDA is whether you have an introduced genetic trait added, or an introduced recombinant DNA construct added to the animal that affects the structure or function of the animal, or creates a new trait. But again, if you don't have that introduced trait, what happens? Do you not have a regulatory process? I think in that aspect, we're going to see some shifts in the paradigm, because I think there, particularly where you have questions about therapeutics, the regulatory bodies are more likely to change their paradigms so as to encompass the technology. There are similar questions on the EPA side as well, particularly in trying to figure out whether you're dealing with an intergeneric organism. All of these questions, of course, create uncertainty, right? But it also creates opportunity, because when you have your early wave products, your early wave submissions to these agencies, it's real opportunity to take good science and shape what should be risk-based policy, not just regulation for the sake thereof.
So touching on that and considering the GMO experience and how the regulatory landscape has developed there, how has the conversation among stakeholders in the food system shaped how GMOs are now regulated?
So the conversation among stakeholders has certainly played a role in regulation. Early on, we saw developers play a role in helping to set the paradigms, helping to develop the regulatory decision trees. Thereafter, now with increased consumer interest, increased consumer demand, we've seen companies as well as regulators respond. Regulators have responded in some ways that are positive. Increased transparency, trying to explain their regulatory frameworks more clearly, trying to explain that the regulatory frameworks are risk-based and not process-based. But we've also seen some responses that, in my opinion, may not generate the most value. Creating regulatory processes that don't add value, that just create unnecessary burdens and stifle innovation, competition, and growth, that's not beneficial for anyone. So I think it's a balancing act. The regulators have a job ahead of them to create a paradigm that encompasses this new breakthrough technology in a way that makes sense, that's risk-based, while also responding to the increased interest that we've seen from consumers.
Now, turning to consumers as stakeholders, Roxy, tell us a little bit about CFI and how you engage in the public debate about our food system.
Sure. So I've got some slides to run through to sort of set this. We've heard about social license, trust. I'll add transparency to the mix. And it actually picks up pretty perfectly based on everything that we've heard here this morning, keeping in mind that definition of innovation that has to do with values. So keep that at the back of your mind as we go through this. I'm trying to cue. Doesn't seem to be working.
Can we get Roxy's slides?
There we go. Okay. I might just have to say ding, because this doesn't seem to be working. So Center for Food Integrity is an organization, a member-based organization. We don't do policy. We try to have facts rule the day, and we're guided by this single mission, which is to earn consumer trust and confidence in today's food system. Next slide. We work with oops, back one. Go back one. We work with about 200 members and project partners across the food system. So we work with everybody from farmers to universities to companies like those you see on the stage, all the way to end retailers and restaurants that serve the consumer's needs. Also even working with consumers and not-for-profit groups like the World Wildlife Fund. We are known a lot based on, next slide, on our, the way that we've thought about trust. At the end of the day, to earn trust means that you have the opportunity to earn and maintain that social license. Social license then allows you to have access to the marketplace and the freedom to operate to do so within, obviously, the rules of the law, but also to find that marketplace that's right for your niche. So in our mind, next slide, social license really is the privilege of operating with minimal or reasonable formalized restrictions, legislation, regulation, market requirements, based on being able to maintain public trust. Public trust is a belief that the activities that are being done and the motivations that are driving those activities are actually consistent with social expectations by all of the different stakeholder groups. So if you're able to maintain social license, you have a social license. If you don't, you're in a situation where social control is the rule of the day. Next slide, please. So, and in any of those situations, there's a tipping point. It could be one big, momentous failure. It could be many, many questions over time in that consumer marketplace of opinions. On the left of the screen, you see social license. If you have this, you have a system that is guided by ethics. It's very values-based. Expectations and self-regulation are sort of managed internally. And it's obviously a system that can be more flexible, lower cost, and regulations are not impingement upon that situation. If you're in a position where social control is your norm, you have a high amount of regulation or legislation that has to go on. You're dealing with compliance, not only the challenge of compliance, but the cost of compliance, which with Sarbanes-Oxley, I think the number is 2.3 million for, or is it billion, for a publicly traded company on an annual basis. So maintaining social license, earning it and maintaining it over time isn't only the right thing to do, it's definitely the most impactful thing that can get your business in the ditch. So paying attention to this isn't just Skittles and rainbows and fluffy stuff, right? It might seem like that at some point, but it really does have that direct impact on the bottom line. If you can go to the next slide, please. To build on trust then, when we formed nearly a decade ago, so still a young organization, we said if earning trust is going to be our mission, we better understand what drives trust. So we worked with Iowa State University, a social scientist, and found what were the drivers of trust, and went through 21 different studies and looked at what are the key drivers that were consistent in each of them. And there are three things. The first is influential others. So who are people in your social sphere of influence, your friends, your family, but also who are the credentialed people you rely on to make decisions. So this could be your veterinarian, your gene editing researcher, it could be your mechanic. The next piece was competence, and this is your facts and your science and your skills, all of those things that we as innovators in this space rely on every day to guide what it is that we're doing. We've been very good about this in the agriculture space, especially, maybe to a fault, which we'll find out. The third piece then is confidence, and this has to do with that perception of shared values, that we are similar to each other. This is all about being a person first and an expert third or fourth or fifth. This research model is actually peer-reviewed and published, and it has allowed itself to be proven time and time again. And if we put the lens through what the big meaning of the research is, when we look at confidence and competence, our ability to share a value with a group and connect with them at a values level versus the ability to share science and information, next slide, what we learned in the research is they're not equal. The perception of shared values is 3 to 5 times more important than having just the facts or the science to build trust and maintain it over time. This is the moment where I watch out for flying tomatoes, because it's never an important or never a popular thing to say that science doesn't rule the day amongst a crowd like this. But the bare fact is, if we haven't done what it takes to share the value and showcase that we're committed to doing the right things for the right reasons, then we won't have the opportunity to talk about these powerful technologies and how they can play and maintain any level of value or contribute value to people's lives. This also brings us, next slide, to our vision of sustainability, because when we came up and learned what that research told us, we got very worried, because science should be the driver for innovation. It should tell us what is the right thing to do. So our version of sustainability has to do with first grounding in ethics. Let's do what's right for every stakeholder that we have to serve, not just ourselves as people who are worried about the bottom line or the customers that we're serving, but their customers and every customer thereafter. So ground in ethics, validate with science, and always have economics in mind, because if you're not profitable, you don't exist as a business. So when you think about the top two pieces of that triangle, science and economics are important, but they really spur to increase people's knowledge or understanding about a topic. And feelings and beliefs are what we want to impact first in an effort to be able to help people understand that we're doing is the right thing to do. We heard earlier as well, I think it was Darren that said, sometimes you can do something, but questioning whether you should is the question that we need to answer, and that's exactly what's going on here. The questions, especially if we take a page out of the Book of Understanding that is GMOs and many other technologies that came before, there are situations where the public is asking, should we be doing this? And we keep answering the question, we can, and here's how. And can and should are different questions, and they need to be treated differently. Next slide, please. So then the question is, are they ready? Are they ready for the new technology? And what we would say is yes, but how you engage is a delicate balance, and it really matters. And so that's how we've really positioned our research in the last few years as it relates to transparency. Next slide. We've really looked into what is transparency. We kept hearing people, especially around the GMO dialogues, say we want more transparency, but they couldn't pinpoint what that meant. So we went through our research, developed a model that would help us understand the elements of transparency. So there are 7, and I'd be happy to go through these at a different time. The takeaway here, and one of the biggest ones, I think, as you think about new products and innovation, is that number 3, stakeholder participation. Active dialogue back and forth. Consumers don't ever expect that you take in every piece of information that they have to share with you or use that information in the way they want it to, but they want it to be considered. Next slide, please. We've also then taken that model of, okay, now we understand the elements of transparency. Let's run them through this, this very specific model that helps us understand what are the specific policies, practices, the validation of what you actually do, your values in action, on the farm, in the lab, et cetera. Performance, how has history dictated how you're going to act in the future, and then verification. We've run that through 6 different topical areas with each of those 7 elements to come ultimately with a trust score. Next slide, please.
I think actually it'd be interesting to hear from the companies, the commercial entities, about how you are experiencing engagement with the public already. What has been your experience? What are you hearing from the public? Anything surprising, or is it GMO part 2?
Well, let me, we have, it's interesting to see their presentation because it resonates very strongly with, with DuPont Pioneer. And since the inception of, our work really believing this was a real potential innovation, right, for the future, we started to engage externally in a range of ways with a range of different groups. And so, we've had sort of small, private engagements with small numbers of people from academia and regulators and NGOs, et cetera, to start to get an understanding of how, what are the issues that they see about a new technology like this. And really, the last meeting we had in Europe, our leader said, it starts first with understanding rather than being understood. So this isn't about teaching people about what's right. It's about really engaging, as Roxy talked about. So we started that process in small groups. We've started to talk globally to regulators to help understand how they see the technology and help them understand in turn, right, how the technology can be used. And I think it comes down to the outcomes, right? It comes down to engaging about the outcomes of the technology, the breadth of its uses, and a wide range of crops, and the impact it can have on farmers' lives. I think that's where we're trying to really engage. It's not about the technology. I mean, I've lived this for a long time. I started in my first company in 1983, and looking up and thinking, wow, we can do so many things, and didn't quite get realized the way I might have expected. So we're really trying to learn deeply from prior technology developments and how they're applied to food.
Yeah, I think part of our approach is it's impossible to talk to a consumer about why gene editing is valuable if they don't understand that humans and plants and all other organisms are made of cells, and cells have DNA inside of them, and that's the blueprint for life. And so that sort of fundamental piece of biology is a core piece of how we start to interact with our community. So I and other members of our team get involved in a variety of discussions, whether it's at one of the local science museums, local community discussions, a panel at South by Southwest about what genome editing is and how it can touch our world. Because I don't think we can have any of these more complicated discussions about is it safe, is it not, should we do it, should we not, until the stakeholders have the right information to engage in that discussion.
DT, jumping back to the regulatory side of things, as we continue to engage with the public, how do you see the regulatory framework developing, and how might the public's role in that affect where the development goes?
So I think we'll see a number of things from regulators. First, we'll see them try to adapt their frameworks to encompass these new technologies. And by encompass, I mean explaining why or where the technologies are not subject to review, and explaining why that fits within the risk-based framework, or explaining why the technologies are subject to review and developing new legal interpretations or policy interpretations as to why. Both of these things will take a fair amount of time, and having spent a number of years at a regulatory agency, I know that regulators, because of consumer demand, consumer interest, themselves are wary about legal risk, that they'll likely spend some time developing their own robust records so they can explain to the public why they've made these decisions. I also think that the federal legislation regarding the labeling of genetically engineered foods or bioengineered foods is likely to have a role as well. USDA is still developing its policies for that and has to undergo a rulemaking for that. And they've interpreted that law to apply somewhat broadly to potentially encompass gene editing technology. Very early on, we need to see what they say in formal rulemaking, of course, but that will play a role, and that will certainly be a role that consumers are quite interested in.
Now, Roxy, as you've applied this model, maybe you could tell us about some of the early reactions that you're seeing from consumers, what they think about new gene editing technologies, and then to leave us on a positive note, maybe tell us where we're getting it right so far, what the industry's doing successfully.
Yeah, we're early on. We haven't started the conversations yet because we understand the immense opportunity that exists with gene editing well above and beyond the agricultural applications. But we are in the process of forming a gene editing coalition. We formed a coalition that had to do with egg-laying hens and housing. And the National Academy of Sciences said, we love that model. We think this needs to be applauded. It's a public-private partnership opportunity. And so we're moving forward on that so that we can have conversations much more publicly and in a way that supports the advancement of this technology and its multiple uses. So I know that's something that Claire has a handout, and I've got some handouts here if anybody is interested in that. So we're very cautious, very, very optimistic that this technology can be immensely helpful, but we have not started outreach on this topic. We actually had a call, our internal team with DuPont, to understand CRISPR-Cas and all of the opportunities there and how it's different from some of the other gene editing tools as well. Some of the places where we're getting it right, I will say, the companies that are paying attention to the customer first, the end customer first. We have lots of examples of how we've thought about, again, the first line of profit, which is the company, and the next one, which is their immediate customer. But there are so many different brands, again, getting back to Matt's perspective of the brand experience, that are looking at wholeheartedly what is it that consumers are saying that they want, and how can we deliver that unique value proposition for them. So also part of our process will be going through and thinking about each of the different stakeholders and understanding what is their skepticism and embracing the skepticism, coming to them with what is the value that they hold near and dear in all the facets of their life, and what are the ways that technology like this can actually benefit either those challenges or those opportunities that they see as consumers. And I won't name specific brands because I don't want to leave anybody out. And certainly as it relates to gene editing, there aren't those yet that are the industry leaders that have done so at a public level that actually is impacting or engaging the broad-based consumer. My hope is that we can all get together in a non-competitive environment and make sure that this technology has the opportunity to really blossom in the way that science tells us it can.
Great. Neil, Rachel, maybe quickly you can tell us some ways that you think your companies are already getting it right, or strategies that you feel confident in or that you've already had success with.
Yeah, I think pointing to sort of some of the local community engagement that we do at Caribou, I think it's really valuable. And identifying how, as a very small company, we can start to broaden that nationally and potentially internationally to engage at that educational level. I think one of the challenges is really how we start to translate that into discussions that include not only people who sit in rooms like this, but consumers who are afraid of these types of products, organizations who have stated claims against these types of products, and really being willing to engage in an open dialogue in that type of situation. I think that needs to come next.
You know, ultimately, people will be the judge of what we're getting right. And, you know, those of you in this audience who've maybe seen people from my company talk about the technology, and our collaborators and competitors talk about the technology, be interested to hear your experience so far of, you know, how that feels. But I think the key is, and it comes back to what Rachel said about the fundamental knowledge base that our customers have, often isn't deep. One of our sessions, it became clear that to some of the people in this, you know, process we were working through, basically said, look, if you do something in the lab, that's a GMO, right? I mean, what does a GMO mean to people, right? If you do it in a lab, it's a GMO. If you do it in the field, it feels okay, right? And so that's a pretty basic level of thinking. And so I think the answer, to some extent, is to anchor to processes that is a little more, I don't know, comfortable. You know, breeding. This is really about natural characteristics of plants, corn genes in corn, working within rice and rice. And I think that should feel more comfortable. Our sense is so far that does feel more comfortable. And then focusing on the outcomes, right? That's, we've had, I think, some pretty good response to that general dialogue. And I think we're listening. We're really trying to understand people. So.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on that, I think there's a bit of a vocabulary problem. In the healthcare sector, it's very sexy to talk about gene editing and gene therapy and modifying cells and correcting mutations. Those are all really positive and exciting and hopeful characteristics that anything from companies to patients get really excited about. On the ag side, those are words that people do not get excited about when they're talking about their food. And so I think finding ways to clearly message what the technology is or isn't, but use words that are appropriate for the stakeholders in different settings. And whether it's precision breeding or advanced breeding or other ways to describe it, that you're using language from the industry that's appropriate for how these products are being developed.
It's an interesting challenge because we've talked about this, right? You know, Caribou works in a global space, right? Global applications, and so the language is really critical. And not to be misleading, not to hide anything, it's about being transparent, but the language will be really important in terms of how it resonates with people and how it makes them feel, and think about what we're doing.
We've got a few minutes. We've got about 12 minutes to open it up for questions. Wait.
So is there thought to how to really use the internet to really try to get the message out? Because there's so much misinformation on the internet and blogging that goes on, and that's really how a lot of people, because they're not fact-checking, so I think that would be a really valuable source of getting the information and the message correct.
Yep. Our research shows that when we ask people, where do you go first for information about food system issues, about 30% of the population's first choice, first source is an online source. 10% go to Google, 22% go directly to a website that they trust, and others, a smaller percentage, go directly to some social media channel. What we do know as well in looking at different people, you know, who is it they want to hear from, how do they, you know, what information and where do they want to find it? We've dug into all of those different pieces and parts, and just as we've been talking about values, it's not only important that the organizations embody the values, but when you think about the stakeholders you're trying to reach, you have to understand what they believe and what they fear to be able to connect with them, and you have to put somebody that actually also shares their world or their life perspective to be able to connect. And I think in terms of the blogosphere and the digital environment, people have self-selected people that they share a value similarity with. So when you look at the blogging community, yeah, this isn't journalism. This isn't cover each topic, both sides. This is intersperse your deepest emotions and perspectives and opinions and talk about issues. And some people have made a business model out of finding their very hard niche on the issues that they don't love and making that their complete focus of discussion.
Just add a quick perspective, I think the internet is really vital here, and social media to the discussion. In terms of who people trust, one of the concepts that came up in one of our engagements was that it's a complex topic. And so you start by looking to someone you trust, right, who maybe has a little more experience with that topic than you do. And so you go to Facebook for your cousin or a friend who's read a paper on the topic, and they say, this is fine or not fine. And then that gets posted, and you post it, and now you got 25 people saying the same thing about that paper, and they trust the Facebook sort of channel that builds, right? Yeah. And so it's a very different world than it was 30 years ago, sort of the last wave of biology and a big way of impacting food. And so I think the internet's going to be incredibly important.
Yeah, and remember that about 90% of people will trust a peer recommendation, so sites like Yelp, to make decisions. Hopefully not on topics as complex as this, but understand that people are looking for information that benefits them here and now, and if they can find a way to reinforce maybe their pre-existing belief or this hard need that they have at that point, that will be something that they'll lean on. So we need to show up more frequently. We need to be, search engine optimization needs to be at the core front of what we're doing. And we need to be where people are when they're looking for the information, and also looking at the terms that we might not like or that they may fear, but those are the ones they're plugging in when they're going to those search engines to understand more.
Next question.
So a lot of the traits that are now enabled with this technology are farmer facing. And we know that there's a huge disconnect between consumers who eat food and the farmers who produce it. So I guess, Neil, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is Pioneer DuPont or any of the other companies thinking about applying this technology towards consumer-facing traits that have a huge benefit to people in order to generate trust of the companies and farmers that use it?
It's a nice question, V. It's a it's a global market. It's not just us, and it's one of the reasons we think that democratization of the technology is really important, right? We have certain crops we work in, and our customers have certain needs. We do work in areas beyond just the farm level. We work in output traits, and I think there's opportunities there to make an impact. But I also think it's part of our effort to engage with other people who might bring other sides of products that are much more directly consumer-facing. And so, we're talking to entrepreneurs and looking at how we can support application of technology to other crops that are, say, specialty crops that'll have more direct consumer, connection and resonance. And so I think that's how we can help that. And, we're developing some of the key capabilities, right, that are important for us to apply the technology, which maybe we can help others also apply in a range of other crops in areas that are sort of connect with people at a more gut level.
Next question. Let's go, gentleman right back there. Yes, that's you. No, you. Yep.
There are going to be some new regulatory guidelines on labeling of products in North America, where you have to designate whether or not there's GMO in those products. And to me, this kind of flies in the face of what we're talking about here. We've already got a population that doesn't understand the difference between plant breeding and GMO, and now they're going to be shopping in the stores, and they're going to be avoiding GMO products. So my sense is that there needs to be, instead of taking little steps, there needs to be some very big steps among corporations and others that have skin in the game to move this agenda forward. And I don't see that happening. Can you comment on this?
Is he asking me?
Whoever wants to jump in first.
Because I look at this as GMO
Well-
version 2, as you said earlier.
I'd like to think of it as not GMO version 2, to be honest, and I think we have a chance to not be that. You know, the labeling laws that have passed this year are, I think, a good thing. You're not going to have state-by-state labeling and that sort of thing. If you look at the definitions, you'll see some interesting aspects of the definitions of what has to be labeled that actually take into account, in fact, this technology already. So, you know, we need to be transparent. Is transparency about the label, or is transparency about access to information? Right? I think there's different ways to be transparent. The way the labels play out will be interesting. And I forget, I mean, it was it Matt before talking about the vision of a QR code, and you can see, you know, it was his farm and, you know, what soybeans he grew. I mean, that kind of mechanism may be a very nice way to get information out over time, to be transparent without going towards labeling in a specific way when it doesn't add value and safety, right? The technology we're developing here has the same, will generally have the same safety profile, we think, as any conventionally bred material, because that's the kind of materials we're working with, natural characteristics of you know, within a crop.
And I'd add too, I'd press on the, you know, consumers will opt out of it, because I don't think that's how the market will flesh itself out. We've done some very informal, you know, asking, do you want it labeled, but why? So that why part of the question is really the one that is the value question. Is it because you want to avoid it like the plague, or is it because you're just interested, or because you just think it's the right that you have? And we're seeing a lot of variance in that yes response. So, and we're already seeing companies do this. We do see this on some labels, and there is a concerted effort. Things like Smart Label and, you know, industry approved and broad adoption of things like this so that people do have access in a way that's clear and concise. We're also seeing groups, retailers, and companies come out and say, hey, we do have a GMO product, and guess what? It's still fully safe, and we still are paying attention to these other attributes that we want, but what we've understood is there's no more value in that end product. So we still got your back. We still provide a product you love, but that's not important to us. So there's some good, I think, balancing of the discussion, and from a media perspective, there has been a lot of coming to the side of science, I would say, in this whole GMO debate. It's less about screaming past everybody in the discussion on opposing ends of the polls, and more about having a, no, let's get down into the nitty gritty of what we do know, and how it's tested, et cetera. So I think the media has, as love to hate them, if that's your game, they really have sort of changed the dialogue as it's related to GMOs in the past couple of years.
And I'll just add that the federal bill that passed, it's a Senate bill that was different from the House bill, very much so. And there is express language in there about safety, about the labeling not being a safety requirement. That opens another box about the labeling being a marketing issue, and AMS and USDA has already made that clear that that's their view of what the bill is. But there is that language there, and I think it will be interesting to see how the definitions about what food is bioengineered will affect the space. And there's opportunity. I mean, USDA does have to go through a rulemaking. It does have to do a public study. So there is opportunity for good submissions to shape where they shake out.
I think we've got time for one, maybe two more.
So, I'm a believer in talking to people. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. As Niels pointed out, they're going to be indistinguishable from the natural products, many of these things. If they're not subject to review, they are not biologically distinguishable. The United States approves their use and their sale, and we start exporting them. How will it possibly be blocked in any way unless we self-identify as somewhere back in the lab somebody used CRISPR to generate this thing, which no one would do? I see, in some ways, all this discussion is fundamentally different from GMOs that way.
It's a good question, and I mean, EU is still shaping its policy. It'll be interesting to see what happens now that we have Brexit. And, you know, maybe Neil and Rachel can say more about any conversations they've had on that topic, but I do think it's under development.
I mean, it's, you know, we know this is an international issue, right? I mean, we're not going to just, you know, DuPont Pioneer is not going to just use a technology that's not accepted in Brazil, if that were the case, and export those products, right? So, or ask our customers to take that risk on doing that, right? So it is very important how the global community approaches the regulatory paradigm, and that will be influenced by the trust of the consumer in this process of discussion and engagement over the next set of years. So, you know, being indistinguishable doesn't mean you know, or that, you know, doesn't mean you don't know it's been used, right? And so we would approach it in a very straightforward, transparent manner, what we use and how we bring the technology and bring products through the technology.
I think we've got time for one final question.
I just wanted to share an experience that I had about 20 years ago, highlighting the importance of listening more than teaching in trying to get this technology section. I was the head of molecular biology at a company called Nitrogen. We discovered over half of the TB toxins in the world. And I went to the National Organic Standards Board, a bunch of organic farmers, to try to get them to approve our new product. This was a DP in a dead pseudomonas cell. We called it cell mapping, sort of intermediate technology. Brain disease and transgenic science. And my goal was really to try to get a sense of what organic farmers would feel that it killed microbial leaf blast, just regulate like EPA. And surprisingly, I found that about 20% of organic farmers would accept a recombinant product if it was killed. Sort of a play on the 1950s, the only good recombinant. And they understood that we took S toxin, we stuck it inside the dead cell, we killed it, it lasted twice as long, those spores, unnecessary toxins. And I was actually pleasantly surprised of the degree of acceptance. They just wanted to make sure this wasn't a slippery slope. And once we approve your killed microbial pesticide, if you're going to come back next year and go with transgenic plants. And I assured them that wasn't the case. So we never actually got that green label, but it was a formative experience for me and my company to sort of get in 1992 what you guys are talking about now with CRISPR-Cas, that is, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth and use them in the appropriate ratio.
Any responses?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, in the small number of consumer group interactions that I've been in thus far, I've been surprised. Sometimes groups who I had assumed would be highly resistant to CRISPR or gene editing were actually quite excited about it, and sometimes it was the other way around. So your point is extraordinarily well taken. Don't make assumptions and listen. And if there are strong reactions one way or the other, actually understanding why people feel the way they do is critical.
Doesn't help to shout louder with facts. We know that, right? So I couldn't agree more.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel. Let's give them a round of applause.